The person an avoidant marries is rarely the person who changed him. This truth is uncomfortable because it goes against the romantic narrative. People want to believe that love automatically leads to commitment, that depth guarantees permanence, that the most meaningful connection naturally becomes the lasting one. For an avoidant, it doesn't work that way. They don't move toward what feels transformative. They move toward what feels survivable. The partner who awakened them emotionally, who cracked open parts of themselves they had kept carefully sealed, didn't feel like home. That connection felt like exposure, like loss of control, like standing in a room with no exits. And for an avoidant nervous system, that isn't intimacy, it's threat. Avoidants are wired to protect autonomy at all costs. Emotional intensity doesn't register as passion. Our promise, it registers as danger. When a connection starts pulling them inward toward vulnerability, self-reflection, or emotional accountability, their system reads it as a warning sign, not a green light. The more deeply they feel, the more their defenses activate. This is why the person who mattered most often becomes the person they step away from. Not because the love wasn't real, but because it was. That level of emotional impact destabilizes the identity they've built around independence and self-sufficiency. Staying would require change. Leaving restores control. The partner who changed them forced awareness. They mirrored unhealed patterns. They exposed emotional blind spots. They invited depth without asking permission. And that kind of connection doesn't just offer love, it demands evolution. For someone who learned early on that closeness equals loss, that demand feels intolerable. So the avoidant reframes the story internally. They call it too much, bad timing, or not right. But underneath those explanations is a simpler truth. That connection reached them too deeply to feel safe. Marriage, for an avoidant, is not about choosing the strongest bond. It's about choosing the bond that doesn't activate fear. Emotional survivability matters more than emotional fulfillment. The person they marry is often someone who fits into their life without requiring them to dismantle their defenses. Someone who doesn't trigger internal chaos. Someone who allows them to stay largely the same. Stability becomes the substitute for intimacy, and predictability replaces passion. This is why the one they loved most often becomes the one they didn't choose. That connection threatened the illusion of control they rely on to feel regulated. Letting it go wasn't a failure of love, it was an act of self-preservation. And understanding this reframes everything. If you were the one who changed them, challenged them, or reached parts of them they rarely let anyone see, your absence from their future isn't proof you lacked value, it's proof your presence mattered enough to scare a system built on emotional avoidance. Safe doesn't mean loving, it means non-threatening. Or an avoidant, safety has very little to do with emotional nourishment and everything to do with nervous system regulation. When they say someone feels safe, what they're really saying is that this person doesn't disturb their internal equilibrium. The safe bet doesn't ask for more presence than the avoidant can comfortably give. They don't challenge emotional distance. They don't require conversations that expose vulnerability. Safety in this context is the absence of activation, not the presence of connection. Avoidants don't choose the safe bet because the bond is profound or magnetic. They choose them because the relationship stays within a narrow emotional bandwidth. There's no volatility, no urgency, no intensity that threatens to pull them out of their controlled emotional range. Passion feels unpredictable. Depth feels destabilizing, but predictability feels manageable. The safe bet becomes appealing, not because of who they are, but because of what they don't evoke. They don't trigger attachment alarms. They don't awaken unmet needs. They don't provoke fear of dependency or loss of autonomy. In avoidant psychology, love is filtered through the question, can I remain myself here without being required to change? A relationship that invites growth, emotional intimacy, or self-examination feels risky because it challenges long-standing coping mechanisms. The safe bet allows the avoidant to stay emotionally contained. There's no pressure to evolve, no confrontation with unresolved wounds, no demand for deeper emotional availability. That's what makes it feel sustainable, not nourishing, but sustainable. This is why avoidants often equate calm with compatibility. When their nervous system stays quiet, they interpret that as proof. They found the right person, but this calm isn't the grounded peace of secure attachment. It's the relief of not being touched where it hurt. The relationship feels smooth because it doesn't go deep enough to encounter friction. There are fewer conflicts, fewer emotional ruptures, not because the connection is healthy, but because expectations are low and intimacy is limited. The safe bet often adapts to the avoidance emotional ceiling. They accept inconsistency. They normalize distance. They don't interpret emotional absence as a problem that needs addressing. This unspoken agreement keeps the relationship stable, but it also keeps it shallow. Safety is maintained by avoiding depth, not by building trust through vulnerability. Understanding this shifts the narrative for those who were not chosen. If you brought depth, curiosity, or emotional presence into the connection, you weren't rejected because you asked for too much. You were perceived as unsafe because you asked for something real. In an avoidance world, predictability feels safer than passion, and control feels safer than love. And the safe bet is simply the person who allows avoidance to remain undisturbed. They marry the one who doesn't ask them to open doors they locked years ago. For an avoidant, emotional access isn't neutral, it's invasive. Those inner doors were closed long before the relationship ever began, often in response to early experiences where closeness felt overwhelming, unreliable, or unsafe. So when a partner asks for emotional presence, consistency, or vulnerability, it doesn't feel like connection. It feels like pressure. The safe bet is the one who never applies that pressure, who doesn't reach for what's been sealed off, and who unknowingly adapts to the avoidance emotional limits. Avoidants feel most at ease with partners who don't interpret distance as a problem that needs solving. The safe bet doesn't question why communication goes quiet or why emotional availability fluctuates. They don't ask for explanations. They don't seek reassurance. They don't request emotional clarity when things feel ambiguous. This lack of demand allows the avoidant to remain unexamined, and that's where comfort lives. There's no risk of being exposed, no fear of being required to articulate feelings they don't fully understand themselves. Emotional access requires presence, and presence requires tolerance for intimacy. For an avoidant, intimacy activates the very defenses they've spent years perfecting. When someone asks them to be emotionally present, to check in, to open up, to stay engaged during discomfort, it threatens the autonomy they equate with safety. The safe bet avoids these moments entirely. They don't push for deeper conversations. They accept surface level harmony as enough. And in doing so, they become the easiest person to stay with. This dynamic creates a relationship where love is expressed through allowance rather than engagement. And the safe bet proves their devotion by not asking for more. They demonstrate loyalty by staying quiet, flexible, and emotionally self-contained. To the avoidant, this feels like understanding. It feels like being accepted as they are. But what's really being accepted is emotional unavailability, and that acceptance reinforces the belief that intimacy is optional, not essential. Marriage, in this context, becomes less about emotional partnership and more about emotional non-interference. The avoidant chooses the person who won't disrupt their internal structure. Someone who doesn't knock when the door is closed, someone who doesn't expect access to rooms. Avoidant has learned to survive without entering. This isn't because the avoidant lacks the capacity for feeling, it's because accessing those feelings feels destabilizing. If you are the one who asked questions, who wanted clarity, who sought emotional reciprocity, your presence wasn't too demanding. It was simply incompatible with avoidance. You represented emotional access, and emotional access threatens the identity an avoidant has built around self-protection. The safe bet isn't chosen because they are more lovable. They are chosen because they require less. And for an avoidant, requiring less feels like safety, even if it costs depth. If their nervous system stays quiet, they call it compatibility. For an avoidant, compatibility isn't measured by emotional resonance, shared vulnerability, or depth of connection. It's measured by how little the relationship activates their internal alarm system. When there's no emotional surge, no anxiety about closeness, no pressure to show up more fully, the relationship feels easy, and ease gets mistaken for alignment. In reality, what they're responding to isn't connection. it's the absence of threat. Avoidants are highly attuned to internal activation. Their bodies learned early on that emotional closeness can lead to overwhelm, loss of autonomy, or disappointment. So when a relationship stays emotionally flat, their system relaxes. There's no pull inward, no demand to self-reflect, no fear of dependency. That quiet is deeply soothing. They interpret it as peace. They label it healthy, but what they're experiencing is regulation, not intimacy. The nervous system is calm because nothing meaningful is being stirred. This is why avoidants often walk away from connections that feel powerful or transformative. Strong chemistry, emotional attunement, or deep bonding doesn't feel exciting. It feels destabilizing. Their body responds with tension, withdrawal, or numbness. In contrast, a low activation relationship feels safe because it doesn't require emotional risk. There's no urgency to engage, no internal conflict about closeness. Everything stays controlled, and control feels like compatibility. The confusion comes from equating emotional neutrality with maturity. Avoidants may believe they've outgrown intensity, or that calm means they're finally choosing wisely. But true emotional maturity doesn't eliminate feeling. It expands tolerance for it. Intimacy doesn't erase activation. It teaches you how to stay present within it. What avoidants often choose instead is a relationship that keeps activation low by keeping depth limited. In these partnerships, there's minimal emotional friction because there's minimal emotional engagement. Conversations stay surface level. Conflict is avoided rather than processed. Needs are unspoken. The relationship runs smoothly because nothing presses too deeply against the avoidance inner world. To outsiders, it looks stable, but stability here is maintained by emotional distance, not by secure attachment. Understanding this reframes the idea of right person. The one who felt calm wasn't necessarily the one who was most compatible. They were simply the one who didn't activate old wounds or unmet needs. The lack of emotional response wasn't a sign of alignment. It was a sign that the avoidant wasn't being asked to show up differently. If you were the one who stirred feelings, who created emotional movement, who challenged comfort zones, you weren't incompatible because you caused chaos. You activated depth. And depth requires capacity. Avoidants don't choose low activation relationships because they're better. They choose them because they're easier to maintain without confronting what intimacy actually demands. They choose the partner who confirms they're fine the way they are. For an avoidant, this validation is not about feeling loved, it's about feeling unchallenged. The safe bet doesn't question their emotional patterns or point out inconsistencies between words and behavior. They don't name withdrawal, detachment, or emotional absence as issues that need attention. Instead, they frame these traits as personality quirks, independence, or maturity. And that framing allows the avoidant to remain comfortable inside an identity that has never been examined too closely. Avoidant coping mechanisms are not random habits. They're survival strategies built early in life. Emotional distancing, self-reliance, and compartmentalization once kept them safe. But those same strategies limit intimacy in adulthood. The safe bet doesn't threaten these defenses. They adapt around them. They accept emotional minimalism as normal. They don't expect consistent emotional presence or reciprocal vulnerability. This quiet acceptance feels like understanding, but what it really offers is permission to stay exactly the same. The partner who challenges an avoidance patterns introduces friction into their self-concept. They reflect back moments of withdrawal. They notice when closeness is avoided. They ask for emotional accountability. This isn't criticism, it's awareness. But awareness threatens the avoidance internal narrative of being self-sufficient and unaffected. The safe bet protects that narrative. They don't hold up mirrors. They don't ask uncomfortable questions. They validate the avoidance sense of self without requiring growth. This validation becomes deeply soothing. When no one is naming the avoidant doesn't have to confront it. They can believe the relationship works because they are fundamentally compatible, not because expectations are low. The absence of conflict is interpreted as emotional health rather than emotional bypassing. Their identity remains intact, and that stability feels like success. Marriage then becomes a place where the avoidance self-image is preserved. They are not asked to develop new emotional skills or expand their capacity for intimacy. The safe bet doesn't demand evolution. They reward consistency, and consistency for an avoidant often means consistent distance. This creates a dynamic where emotional stagnation is mistaken for balance. If you were the one who challenged them, who named patterns, asked for growth, or reflected emotional gaps, you weren't trying to change them. You were inviting them to become more. But for someone whose identity is built around avoidance, becoming more feels like losing themselves. So they choose the partner who validates their current form rather than one who invites transformation. Understanding this shifts the meaning of being passed over. The safe bet isn't chosen because they are superior. They are chosen because they allow the avoidant to remain unthreatened. And in the avoidance world, preserving identity often matters more than expanding it, even when expansion is where real intimacy lives. They don't ask, "Do I feel deeply?" They ask, "Does this work?" For an avoidant, love is often translated into function. Emotional experience is unreliable and risky, but systems are predictable. So when it comes time to commit, the internal evaluation shifts away from feeling and toward practicality. Does this relationship fit into my life without disrupting it? Does it support my routines, my independence, my goals? If the answer is yes, it feels like the right choice, even if the emotional connection is muted. Marriage, in this framework, becomes a structural decision rather than an emotional one. Stability matters more than resonance. Timing matters more than longing. Compatibility is measured through shared logistics, similar lifestyles, aligned plans, low emotional maintenance. The relationship is assessed like a system that needs to run smoothly, not like a bond that needs to be deeply felt. And when everything functions without friction, the avoidant experiences relief. That relief gets mistaken for love. Avoidants often mistrust strong feelings. Intensity has historically come with consequences: overwhelm, disappointment, loss of autonomy. So when love feels contained, manageable, and emotionally quiet, it feels safer. There's no fear of being consumed, no risk of losing control. The absence of emotional extremes becomes the standard for healthy. In this way, love is downregulated until it fits comfortably inside the avoidance tolerance window. This is why functional relationships are so appealing. They don't require emotional attunement beyond what's necessary to keep things running. There are roles, routines, and expectations, but little emotional demand. The partner becomes a teammate rather than an intimate emotional presence. The relationship works because it doesn't ask for much beyond cooperation and consistency. From the outside, this kind of marriage can look ideal. It's stable, organized, and drama-free, but internally something is missing. Emotional depth has been replaced by emotional management. Feelings exist, but they are carefully contained, never allowed to expand into vulnerability or dependence. The relationship is successful by practical standards, but emotionally restrained. For the avoidant, this restraint feels responsible. It feels like choosing wisely rather than impulsively. But true intimacy isn't reckless. It's regulated connection, not emotional absence. When love is reduced to function, the relationship may last, but it rarely transforms. Growth is limited because growth requires feeling, and feeling requires risk. If you were the one who brought emotion into the equation, who asked how it felt, not just whether it worked, you weren't being impractical. You were speaking the language of intimacy. But intimacy can't be quantified or scheduled, and that uncertainty is exactly what avoidants try to avoid. Understanding this reframes the choice they made. They didn't choose function over you because it was better. They chose it because it was safer. And in the avoidant world, safety often outweighs depth, even when depth is what creates real connection. It looks calm because nothing inside them is being touched. From the outside, an avoidance marriage to the safe bet often appears stable, mature, even ideal. There's consistency in routines, reliability in behavior, and an absence of dramatic conflict. Friends admire how easy the relationship seems. Family points to its longevity as proof it's healthy, but what's being mistaken for emotional security is often emotional disengagement. The calm exists not because the bond is deeply secure, but because nothing inside the avoidant is being activated enough to cause friction. In these marriages, expectations around emotional closeness are quietly lowered from the start. The safe bet doesn't push for intimacy, doesn't question emotional distance, and doesn't interpret withdrawal as a rupture that needs repair. Because closeness was never required, there are no arguments about it. There's no ongoing negotiation for presence, vulnerability, or reassurance. The relationship runs smoothly precisely because it avoids the very areas where conflict would naturally arise. Consistency becomes the most visible marker of health. The avoidant shows up in predictable ways, fulfills responsibilities, and maintains surface level harmony. This reliability is real, but it's structural rather than emotional. The marriage functions well on the outside because it's organized around roles and routines, not around emotional attunement. There are agreements, not deep emotional exchanges. Stability is achieved by staying within a narrow emotional range that feels manageable for the avoidant. Society tends to reward this kind of partnership. Big Helm is praised, drama-free relationships are idealized. Emotional intensity is often pathologized. So when a marriage looks peaceful and efficient, it's automatically labeled healthy. But emotional health isn't defined by the absence of conflict. It's defined by the capacity to engage when conflict or closeness arises. In avoidant safe bet marriages, those moments rarely surface because the emotional depth required to trigger them is missing. Inside the relationship, emotional needs are often minimized or internalized. The safe bet adapts by self-soothing or seeking emotional fulfillment elsewhere. The avoidant remains largely undisturbed, interpreting the lack of emotional demands as proof of compatibility. Both partners may believe they're doing something right because nothing feels overtly wrong. But what's missing is the sense of being deeply known or emotionally held. This is why the marriage can last for years without obvious breakdowns, while still feeling subtly empty. There are no explosive conflicts, but there are also no moments of profound emotional connection. The calm is maintained by emotional avoidance, not by emotional safety. Understanding this matters because it reframes appearances. Just because a relationship looks stable doesn't mean it's emotionally rich, and just because your connection with an avoidant felt intense or difficult doesn't mean it was unhealthy. Intensity often signals depth. The absence of it often signals protection. The marriage looks calm because it was designed to keep everything just out of reach, where it can't disrupt the avoidant's internal world. The one who reached them stays unfinished in their nervous system. For an avoidant, unresolved connections don't vanish just because a different life choice was made. They don't process emotional endings the way securely attached people do. Instead of fully feeling and integrating the loss, they compartmentalize it. The intensity of the connection gets sealed off, stored away in the body, rather than resolved in the mind. Outwardly, they move on. Inwardly, something remains suspended, unfinished, untouched, and quietly active beneath the surface. The person they didn't marry is often the one who bypassed their defenses. That connection activated longing, vulnerability, and emotional awareness they weren't prepared to hold. Leaving wasn't closure, it was containment. By choosing safety and predictability, the avoidant created distance from the discomfort, not resolution of it. The feelings didn't end. They were simply put somewhere inaccessible. This is why avoidance can appear detached and certain after walking away, while the emotional imprint of the connection continues to live on in the background. Compartmentalization allows avoidance to function, but it doesn't erase emotional memory. The body remembers what the mind avoids. Over time, as life stabilizes and the nervous system no longer needs constant protection, those stored emotions can resurface. Often this happens years later when the marriage feels routine, when the distractions of novelty and structure fade, or when a moment of vulnerability cracks the emotional container. That's when old feelings resurface, not as clear longing, but as curiosity, restlessness, or unexplained nostalgia. This delayed emotional processing is why avoidants sometimes revisit the past emotionally long after the relationship ended. It's not always about wanting the person back. It's about revisiting the part of themselves that was activated in that connection. The intensity represented a version of them that felt more alive, more open, more emotionally present. When safety becomes monotonous, the unresolved connection becomes a reference point for what depth once felt like. Importantly, this doesn't mean the avoidant regrets their marriage in a simple way. The regret is more abstract. It's not about choosing the wrong partner, it's about leaving a part of themselves unexplored. The unresolved connection symbolizes emotional capacity that was never fully developed, and because it was never integrated, it remains psychologically unfinished. For the person who is left, this explains why the bond can feel lingering even without contact. You weren't forgotten, you were compartmentalized, you existed in a space the avoidant didn't know how to return to safely at the time. And unresolved emotions don't fade on a timeline. They wait until the system feels stable enough to feel them. Understanding this shifts the narrative. The connection mattered because it reached them, and anything that reaches an avoidant deeply doesn't disappear. It gets postponed. The past isn't revisited because it was better. It's revisited because it was incomplete. Regret doesn't come from who they chose. It comes from what they avoided. Avoidants rarely look back and question the suitability of their marriage in conventional terms. The person they married is usually predictable, steady, and low maintenance. Exactly what they saw. What haunts them isn't the partner, it's themselves. It's the version of who they could have been if they had stayed in the connections that demanded growth, vulnerability, and emotional presence. That capacity, the tolerance for intimacy, the courage to stay with discomfort, the willingness to evolve is what they never fully cultivated. Avoidants tend to avoid the very experiences that force them to confront themselves. So when they reflect years later, the awareness that a part of them remained dormant can manifest as regret. Not for what they gained, but for what they bypassed. This regret is subtle and often compartmentalized, just like their unresolved emotions. It doesn't drive impulsive decisions or public declarations. It surfaces quietly as curiosity, melancholy, or a flicker of what if when life slows down and safety stops being the constant distraction it once was. It's never about the spouse or the logistics of the marriage. They don't question the stability, the timing, or the predictability of the choice they made. Instead, it's about the emotional and psychological depth they sidestepped, the lessons they deferred, and the parts of themselves they never fully explored. Regret in the avoidant world is introspective rather than relational. It's an internal acknowledgement of avoidance, not of love lost. If you weren't chosen, it doesn't mean you weren't enough. For the person left behind, this is the critical shift in perspective. Being overlooked by an avoidant doesn't reflect a deficit in your worth or your love. You weren't too much, you weren't too intense, you weren't flawed, what you represented. Emotional depth, curiosity, vulnerability, and the courage to challenge avoidance was simply incompatible with a system built to equate closeness with danger. Your presence illuminated aspects of connection they were never ready to hold. And that incompatibility is not a judgment of your value. It's a reflection of their capacity at the time. Understanding this empowers you to release self-blame. Avoidants rarely reject for reasons of merit. They reject for reasons of survival and regulation. If you are the one who sparked introspection, brought depth, or demanded reciprocity, it means your energy mattered. It means the connection was real and transformative. But the avoidance system couldn't integrate it, so the choice was made for safety over growth. And that safety often comes disguised as stability, responsibility, or rational compatibility, while what was lost remains internal, contained within the avoidance nervous system. The takeaway is profound. Your worth is not measured by whether an avoidant could stay with you. You weren't rejected, you were incompatible with avoidance. Your presence highlighted emotional realities that were too big for them to contain. And while they may carry subtle, quiet regret about the depth they avoided, you carry forward the truth of your own value, integrity, and emotional completeness. You were enough, always, and the only reason you weren't chosen was because avoidance cannot tolerate real intimacy.